In recent days, you've gone back to the political declaration of December 2017. You might explain that kind of logic behind that why that might stand in the event of a no-deal Brexit, given that the agreement, the divorce agreement, if that's not ratified by Westminster, the December 2017 agreement is hardly going to count. It's as worthless as a divorce deal. I just wonder if you can explain maybe the background to that.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Sorry, Taoiseach, we'll just as well go to RTE maybe. Sean, no. Okay, Taoiseach.
Yeah, no. The point that I've made repeatedly is that long before the withdrawal agreement was agreed between the 28 governments, and that was the result of a long and tortuous negotiating process where effectively a backstop and an Irish protocol as part of withdrawal agreement was designed around British red lines because of an insistence of the UK on leaving the customs union and single market, as well as the European Union. Then the backstop was the only workable fallback position that was going to act as an insurance mechanism. So in other words, if the future relationship discussions didn't comprehensively deal with delivering an absence of border infrastructure, if there weren't other proposals that could solve the problem, well then the backstop kicked in. But the original conversations around the principle of that insurance mechanism, if you like, happened in the build-up to December 2017, when Ireland made the case that, look, we can't move this negotiation on to talk about the future relationship unless we get a guarantee from the UK side that no decision they will make will result, as an unintended consequence of it, because nobody wants border infrastructure, in physical border infrastructure re-emerging. And that is why, in December 2017, essentially, in order to move the process on, the British government gave a guarantee to Ireland and to the EU that they would deal, working with the EU, with the Irish border in three ways. In one of three ways, I should say. First of all, they hoped to be able to solve this problem with a comprehensive future relationship agreement, but if that wasn't possible, they would offer bespoke solutions to Ireland. But if there was no agreement on those bespoke solutions, which presumably would have been technology and so on, then the default position, if you like, would be to maintain full alignment with the rules of the customs union and single market in the areas necessary to prevent border infrastructure, to facilitate an all-island economy now and in the future, and to protect the peace agreement. That was very clear. It was a political agreement. It wasn't contingent on a withdrawal agreement being finalised. And so that principal discussion, in return for which, by the way, Ireland and the EU moved the process on, which is what the UK were looking for, to talk about the future relationship and what it might look like. And so that commitment and that political discussion at the time, I think, is very relevant in the context of a no-deal Brexit should it happen. Because nobody on this island wants to see physical border infrastructure re-emerging, and therefore we know that we can do this through regulatory alignment if no other mechanism works. And certainly in a no-deal scenario, the British government, the Irish government and the EU would have to work collectively together to figure out a way of doing that. But I suspect the regulatory alignment route would end up looking something quite similar to the current backstop proposal, because of course we have looked at this and all alternative proposals, and the only workable solution that I think is on the table right now, having looked at this for 2 years or so, is a mechanism that looks very like the backstop. So that's where this is coming from, Simon, and I don't think it's an unreasonable ask to ask the British government to follow through on a commitment that they've already made in this area, which, by the way, is in their interests too, in the context of Northern Ireland and the people there, as well as, of course, ours.
Okay. Sorry, Simon, we have to move on. We're under pressure. Sean Defoe.
I'll try to come back to that in a second.
Sorry, Sean.
Sorry, Sean.
Go on, quick.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, we're challenged in lots of ways in relation to North-South cooperation, even if there is a Brexit deal, because we don't have devolved institutions in Northern Ireland. The North-South Ministerial Council isn't meeting as a result. Many of the North-South bodies don't have the kind of political direction that they need because of the absence of devolved government installment. So there are many challenges there, even in the absence of the pressures of Brexit. Brexit, of course, adds to that even further. And that is why the British and Irish governments do need to work closely together in relation to the issues that will involve North-South cooperation in the context of Brexit, deal or no deal, as we move through the next few weeks and months. And as late as last night, I would have been speaking to my counterpart in the British government about those issues.
Okay, Sean Defoe.
Taoiseach, in relation to the beefing up of Enterprise Ireland, essentially to provide more investment, is there going to be government money put behind that? And in terms of individual businesses, what can they expect from there? And also in relation to, you've been talking about this week, support from the EU for farmers, fisheries and small businesses. Is there an amount agreed there? Is there a fund the EU have put aside? Or what kind of numbers are we talking about?
Well, first of all, what this legislation does for Enterprise Ireland is effectively it gives them the capacity to lend to a business. They don't actually have the legal basis to do that right now. At the moment, Enterprise Ireland can essentially take an equity stake in a company, or they can provide grant aid. But loan facilities are being facilitated as well. I think the one element of this legislation that we would probably be doing anyway, but not in this timeline, is in the increased capacity for Enterprise Ireland to be able to have more flexibility in terms of how they support businesses. This would have been part of a broader piece of legislation that probably would have been introduced between now and the end of the year. But we fast-forwarded this element of it so that Enterprise Ireland would have maximum flexibility to support businesses, particularly in vulnerable sectors. We also know that we have a change in the state aid rules that allows Enterprise Ireland to be able to give more money directly to businesses that may be vulnerable as a result of external pressures, in this case Brexit. And we're seeing some reports in the media today of the first example of the supports that may be made available to certain companies in the food industry in the context of Carberry Group, who are working with Enterprise Ireland in that regard. So I think that potentially is a flavour of things to come in terms of how the state may be able to support companies to diversify because of an external factor outside of their control into other markets. In terms of the broader financial supports that may be available, I think it is too early to say. I was at a long Brexit meeting last night in Sligo and we talked about this with farming organisations. Until we know or have more detail on what a no-deal Brexit looks like from a British perspective in the context of the trading environment that they would or wouldn't facilitate, as regards the application of tariffs, for example, or none, for that matter, then it is hard to anticipate what this might cost to support a business, to allow them to survive through a very difficult transition period where they would have to look to diversify away from the UK potentially. So what we're doing at the moment with the Commission and within our Department of Agriculture in particular is to look at different options that could be adopted depending on circumstances and decisions in Westminster. It's really extraordinary that with 36 days to go we don't have clarity on some of these things, but that's where we are and that's what we need to that's what we need to adapt to.
Okay, Stephen O'Brien.
To add to that, maybe just looking at a more longer term and support from the Commission and from the European Union. The discussion at the moment at the General Affairs Council and the Finance is now focusing on the next 7-year term for the European budget, which is 1.135 trillion, but obviously that's not taking into account the possibility in a no-deal scenario that the current budget might be impacted as well. So there are discussions ongoing as to what flexibility could be within the next budget to deal with the possible outcome of Brexit. So that's looking at a more longer term, and obviously CAP, research, innovation and various other areas would be significant for us in that regard.
Okay, thank you, Minister. Stephen at the front.
Thank you. Is it possible to put legally binding language in the political declaration that accompanies, or the protocol that accompanies the withdrawal agreement? And if, as I suspect, it's not, what then what guarantees or assurances can you add to that document that might bring us beyond where we are?
Yeah, and I think that's a very good question. I mean, what the EU has said clearly, and and it's been an extraordinarily consistent message from EU heads of state, from President Juncker, from President Tusk, from Michel Barnier, is that the EU regards the withdrawal agreement as closed. It was a very difficult negotiation to get agreement on. It involved a lot of compromise on the EU side as well as compromise on the British side. And if you start to reopen that, there will be other EU countries who will look to reopen other things. And so the EU doesn't want to go there and isn't going to go there. And so that's why they've said, look, the withdrawal agreement, the Irish protocol is part of that withdrawal agreement, and the wording of the backstop that applies isn't going to change. And we're not going to reopen that text. Having said that, the EU, I think, is looking at ways and working with the UK on this of trying to provide more reassurance on the temporary nature of the backstop and how they could do that convincingly so as to allow potentially, the British Attorney General to be able to change his advice to a British Parliament. And I think that is what's being explored at the moment in terms of how that might be done in a way that doesn't undermine the backstop, but at the same time recognises the reassurance that's needed in Westminster because of the concern that the backstop may not be temporary. Now, of course, our perspective on that is very clear. First of all, we don't want the backstop ever to be used because we want a comprehensive future relationship that doesn't require it. Secondly, if it is ever used, we want it to be temporary. But it's got to be temporary on the basis of actions as opposed to set time limits. And what we mean by that is it's got to be there unless and until it's replaced by something else that does the same job. But we're up for looking at alternative ways of doing the same job. But that's got to be convincing. It can't just be wishful thinking. And so the idea of applying a time limit to the backstop without being able to answer the question, what happens at the end of that time limit, convincingly, to be able to reassure people that alternative arrangement won't result in border infrastructure, effectively means that it wouldn't be a backstop at all. And so I think that is the difference between the two sides politically at the moment, where we're saying the backstop, yes, if it's ever used, would be temporary and can be replaced by alternative arrangements, which, by the way, is catered for in the text of the withdrawal agreement today, which a lot of people don't seem to realise. Alternative arrangements are referred to. They can be part of review mechanisms that can replace the backstop. But they have got to do the same job. And the reason why this is such a difficult issue to resolve is that nobody has come up with an alternative to the backstop that does the same job, that stands up to scrutiny. Not yet, anyway. That may materialise in the future, and we're open to that. But we can't sign up to a deal that is essentially treating the Irish border as a promise to be solved in the future. And give up on a legal guarantee that is currently in place in the deal. But look, the other thing I would say is that while the EU is not up for changing the wording of the withdrawal agreement for the reasons I've outlined, they're certainly up for changing the text of the Future Relationship Declaration if the UK wants to do that. And I think there are ways of providing reassurance to the UK in relation to the intent to get a future relationship deal done in a timely manner, which of course may well answer and deal with the questions of preventing the need to use a backstop in the first place. And I think that could certainly be helpful.
Cormac.
Tánaiste, two questions. Firstly, there's quite a tight timescale for getting this through the Oireachtas. Do you expect cooperation from the opposition, and how confident are you that it won't affect the St Patrick's Day programme for ministers? Secondly, in relation to tariffs, you raised the spectre of milk being produced in the north and processed in the south being slapped with 40% tariffs yesterday at the committee. Pascal Donoghue talked about how revenue might need extra resources if there are issues in the supply chain arising. So essentially, are these checks on goods, and where would they take place, at the border or elsewhere? I mean, has that been worked out yet in terms of applying tariffs?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair question, and I think in the context of a no-deal Brexit, there are questions that will need answers. Those answers can only be provided by the UK and Irish governments working with the EU to actually put mechanisms in place that can work for all sides. But the insistence that we will make on any discussions like that will be that they will not result in physical border infrastructure re-emerging. And that we would also argue very strongly for the method to do that being regulatory alignment, which certainly I would hope may also result in giving preferential treatment to farmers in Northern Ireland in a way that doesn't result in the imposition of any tariffs or SPS checks. And I think that, by the way, that is doable. We do it today. Even within the European Union, Northern Ireland, from an animal health perspective, has been treated as an all-island responsibility, which, of course, the devolved institutions in Northern Ireland agreed to and have worked with the Irish government on in a way that's been in the interests of farming north and south. So there are ways in which we can resolve these issues. But, of course, there needs to be two willing contributors to those discussions and those plans to be able to do it. What was the first question again?
Cooperation.
Oh yeah, can we get it done? Yeah, on St. Patrick's Day stuff. Well, first of all, this is the most important thing that the government needs to do between now and the end of March, including the really important work around St. Patrick's Day. But this is the priority. The country potentially faces an emergency situation, which we are preparing for now in as comprehensive a way as we can. I think we will get this done in time. We've already got a lot of cooperation from opposition parties. I think we've briefed them thoroughly. I've also briefed the chairs of the relevant committees. We will continue to brief opposition parties both on and offline, whatever they prefer. We'll take on board their amendments. Obviously, we'll test them, but if they make sense, if we've missed something, we'll fix that. This is in no way party political. This is a collective effort by the Oireachtas. Obviously, it's my job and Helen's job to give leadership in terms of what's needed and to work with the 9 government departments that are all contributing as well. But all of the indications that we've got from the opposition parties is that they want to be helpful, they recognise the seriousness of this issue, and that they'll work with us on the timeline that Helen has outlined for you. And on the St. Patrick's Day, yeah, I mean, look, one of the things my department does is it tries to coordinate where ministers go all over the world for St. Patrick's Day, which is important, by the way, and we're visiting more countries than we've ever visited this year. There's a big emphasis on the EU, though, for obvious reasons linked to Brexit solidarity. That's why I'm staying quite close to home. But we will make appropriate decisions in relation to St. Patrick's Day and, quite frankly, everything else for the next few weeks in order to prioritise this legislation and the other preparations that are necessary to prepare for a worst-case Brexit scenario. But we will also be focusing on trying to find solutions that will prevent that happening. And I think we can. I think that's very unlikely. The annual meeting between the Taoiseach and the US President is a very important opportunity for Ireland on lots of levels, to speak to Irish America, to lobby for our interests, to solidify the relationship between the US and Ireland. It's a really, really important meeting every year, and I think it's very unlikely that that meeting will be affected. Well, I mean, you can't rule anything out with Brexit. That's the truth. But I think we will work. I think we'll be able to work around that. But that doesn't mean that some ministers' visits may be shortened or curtailed, depending on how the month of March goes from a Brexit perspective.
Okay, moving on. Stephen Murphy.
Taoiseach, you've said just with the North-South issue, the solution after a no-deal Brexit would be regulatory alignment. That would look a lot like the backstop, and that's something that the Taoiseach has said. My question is, if we can't get agreement now on a backstop before a Brexit, what makes you think that we'd be able to get an agreement on basically a pseudo backstop or backstop 2.0 after a no-deal Brexit?
Because the British government have made clear commitments in this area. You know, the Prime Minister has come to Northern Ireland even in the last few weeks and made commitments that she would do everything to ensure that we wouldn't see a return to the borders of the past. and there are competing obligations here. We have, as co-guarantor of the Good Friday Agreement, as indeed the British government has, a responsibility to the people, not only of Northern Ireland, but of the island of Ireland as a whole, in terms of how they interact, how they move around, how they trade with each other, how North-South cooperation works, and so on. And there is an obligation on the government that I'm part of, but also on the British government, to ensure that we can find solutions that work, even on a temporary basis, to give us more time to look at other solutions. But we have to find a way of ensuring that we put in place solutions that work for Northern Ireland in the context of the border issues and in the context of protecting the Good Friday Agreement, which the British government has always said that they will protect as a priority through Brexit. And is anybody seriously suggesting that because there isn't a deal, that all of the commitments and all of the conversations and all of the reassurance that has been given to people in Northern Ireland in the context of protecting the Good Friday Agreement, that all of a sudden that's worth nothing because there isn't a deal on the broader issues of Brexit? We've always said that finding solutions on the border question will be much more difficult in the context of a no-deal Brexit. But I think we also need to be honest about what we think is required to get that job done. Should the Parliament in Westminster make the decision to trigger that, because that will be a British decision. Let's be very clear. The British government has negotiated an agreement that the EU has signed up to. If the British Parliament decides not to ratify that agreement, even with the assurances, the extra assurances that the EU wants to offer, well, then that is a decision for the British Parliament. And there are consequences to that, that they have a responsibility to respond to with us, and we'll work with them in that regard. But I think the solution lies in the approach that I've outlined already.
Okay, we'll take one last question. Mary?
So you've spoken about the cooperation from across the Oireachtas in relation to this, and the indications from the opposition are that they will cooperate, but some have suggested that maybe more time should have been given to this legislation. What would you say to some criticism that the timeline for this is actually quite tight to get this done?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair question, but actually very little in this legislation today is new. We did publish a number of weeks ago the heads of this bill, and it's still more or less the same. So the way we've approached this is we approached the heads of the legislation to show what was going to be in it, and then it takes a number of weeks to turn that into a drafted piece of law, which is what we have now. So we've been talking about the issues and the problems that we're solving in this legislation for weeks now, and we've been briefing the opposition on that. So there are no surprises, and there shouldn't be any surprises this morning for people who've been following this detail. But what we have always said is that, do we want to essentially disrupt the work of government and the Oireachtas in as fundamental a way as we're going to be doing next week and the week after for legislation that may not be needed? I think it is now at a point, though, that we need to trigger not just planning for a no-deal Brexit, but actually actioning those plans. And that's why I think we can get this done by mid-March, which gives a potential cushion, if you like, at the end of that, of nearly 2 weeks before the 29th of March, should anything go wrong, or if there are any amendments, for example, in the Shannon that require this to come back to the Dáil, there is the time and space to be able to do that. This is legislation that we hope will never be used. Well, there's one element of it, actually, that will be enacted. That's the element that if we get a deal, which I believe we will, with the UK, that then facilitates a withdrawal agreement and a transition period, which will be somewhere between 2 and 4 years. That actually, there's the last section of this legislation effectively will recognise the UK as a member state in law during that transition period, even though they'll no longer be a member state. But apart from that section, the rest of it is all essentially planning for a no-deal scenario. Yes, we have left it to the end of the negotiation, but that's for good reason. But no one's surprised by it, and we've been briefing all along, which is why I think the opposition are pretty comfortable with facilitating it, and we'll work with them if they have any problems.
That's great. Thank you, Taoiseach. Thank you, Minister. Thank you, everyone.